Hello and welcome to the Archaeosoup Towers Christmas Special 2016. Christmas is almost upon us. It's been a very busy and at times slightly out of control year for me. It's been a very strange and bizarre year in other spheres of life. But we're almost at Christmas, and that can only be a good thing, surely. And this year we have a wonderful Christmas special for you. You may recall that a few years ago now, we were called on to do a desk-based assessment by my friend, an archaeologist called Marion. And she was, she was very lucky. She had been invited to do work ahead of redevelopment plans that were going to go forward in Santa's compound in Lapland. So we did a desk-based assessment, and the following year we actually got to see some material that was coming up out of the excavation, including the melted candy canes and the sort of some of the other artifacts. I'll put links to those videos at the end and also in the description below. But then things went a bit quiet. Last year we basically we couldn't do anything really with her because she was so weighed down by the mountain of post-excavation work she had to do, publication, interpretation, so on and so forth. So I did something else last year, but this year we have a hitherto embargoed bit of news, and that is that she's found something else. There was actually a small extension to the excavation. Santa, while there was already upheaval on site, decided that he wanted to resurface the reindeer and sleigh landing area, and also actually where they keep the snowmobiles as well, for day-to-day travel between the elf village and the compound. So this surface is very special. It's so like a cobble concrete tarmac mix with glitter mixed in. Of course, you need to be able to see where you're going to land your sleigh, obviously. And initially, Marion was called in to do the watching brief. So she was just literally watching as the elves and their engineers were just pulling up the old surface to replace. But something was there. She noticed that actually underneath that old landing area surface was machinery. And this wasn't actually wooden machinery as we had seen in previous artifacts. This was actually much closer to clockwork, or even even steam-powered industrial sort of iron and steel. So she halted work and went to see Santa. Now, Santa, it seems, is a good developer. He and Marion have actually developed quite a good working relationship. And on the understanding that she didn't go too far into November, because that's when things really get going in and around the compound, she was actually able to halt work and do a proper excavation of what had been uncovered. Now, yes, there were elements of machinery, and this was quite badly corroded and damaged. It was never going to be reconstructed. But thankfully, in Santa and some of the elves, we have some eyewitness, essentially, capacity. So they knew what she had found. But what's great is actually she was able to document evidence of what she had found. And that is, the evidence actually comes in the shape of this. It is actually unstratified ash from Santa's Grotto, Lapland, the 2016 excavation, in and around the sleigh park, context 23, unstratified ash. Now this isn't just any old ash. What this is in fact the ash from unreconstituted Santa letters. Now it's worthwhile just taking a step back to explain this. The way in which people contact Santa to ask him for their presents at Christmas has changed over the years, but it really got going around the 1890s, when, especially in places like Britain, literacy was rising to around 75%, and also Santa was becoming much more popular again. He had been popular back in pre-Christian times. He had a rise in popularity in the Middle Ages, and the Saint's Day of Saint Nicholas, when he would work actually in partnership with Saint Nick. And the two of them actually, in and around the 6th of December, were very popular in terms of giving presents and kids receiving goodies. But at the end of the 1800s, it was very much kicking off, and people were sending their letters in various ways. There was actually one chap, I've made a note here, called W. Reginald Bray, who would regularly test the limits of the postal service by, for example, posting himself to different places. But what this really highlighted, and he also actually tried to write to Santa, it highlighted that Santa needed a way to receive letters. So some people would post them directly to him, and thankfully the postal service quite quickly cottoned on, and they were able to help with that. But other people would actually put their letters up the chimney. The idea being that the rising hot air, and then also the cold air that's being sucked down the chimney, would sort of shoot the letter up into the air, and it would then find its way to Santa. Obviously, if you've addressed it properly, otherwise it just falls on the floor outside. It's all in the address, you see, and the proper zip code or postcode. But some letters during that process would either be singed or even completely burnt up into ash, actually. So it may look as though they burned on the fire, but actually what's happened is they have the ash goes because the letter and the address was written properly. So this stuff was arriving in the North Pole, and Santa and co really had to try and figure out what to do with it, because you know clouds of this stuff was just hanging around in the air above the compound. So in this instance, when a chimney delivery goes wrong, what they decided to do was to use a letter reconstitution mechanism, and that is exactly what this machine was that they had uncovered. It was a solution to a problem which is now a bit out of date, really. We no longer send Santa lists or letters via chimney. People even email Santa directly, in fact, these days, and there's all sorts of other ways. But back, in that crucial time when loads and loads of children could read and write, they were shooting their letters away, and they needed a way to make sure that they could be read at the other end. So this is what we have. Now we actually have a drawing of what the machine probably looked like. Apparently nowhere near all of the parts have been recovered, but this is also based on eyewitness accounts from, for example, Santa. You can see that the letters would go into the machine here. The machine was very much powered by coal and also wood as well, burning away, and through a process which Santa refuses to let me in on, which is a real shame. Apparently it's linked with the same magic that reconstitutes him as he comes down chimneys or walks through letterboxes or something. Through that process, which he uses on Christmas Eve himself, they actually were able to reconstitute from the ash the children's letters, and out of that process they would successfully be able to read what it was that the children were asking for. So we have here, for example, some example letters. Sometimes, I mean, these are much more modern. Things. So, for example, we have colouring in, elements of colouring in. We have, for example, to Santa at the North Pole, this kind of thing. Christmas cards. That was actually something which Santa would receive quite often. And so the machine had to be able to for example, differentiate, the contents of the letter from the glitter on the outside. Now, obviously, glitter wasn't a late Victorian thing. Glitter came in later on, for example, towards the middle 20th century. That's when people started really glamming up their letters. But nonetheless, the technology was there, and sometimes actually even elves would be sent a letter directly as well. For example, this one here, let's have a look. Says, let's see, to the elves, Merry Christmas, love, Oliver. So it was a complex machine, clearly, and in that sense, this really does represent a fascinating discovery, and also a fascinating insight into the, into life and correspondence at the North Pole. Now, some of the earliest letters and cards that Santa would receive, he found to be a little bit strange. They actually would paint him in a very sort of disciplinarian kind of way. He was shown as being essentially like a bishop who was there to sort of, to instill the parents' will upon children. And I have to say, one thing I have heard is that Santa, while he does like you to be nice, he also accepts that a bit of naughtiness also keeps you interesting. So early on, actually, there was he was being used almost as a tool to keep children in line. But over time, the dialogue between the children and Santa has become much more direct, much more, for him at least, much more pleasing. Now, before people were sending letters, actually Santa relied on some older techniques. For example, back when he was in his former role, or one of his former roles as, for example, Odin, king of the Viking gods, he had two ravens, pet ravens called Thought and Memory, and these would circle the globe and tell him what it was that people desired. And well, according to some, he's a bit shady about this, but according to some, he actually would go around on a sleigh pulled by an 8-legged horse, dropping off gifts, especially to Viking children at the end of their bed. They'd sort of swap carrots for goodies and this kind of thing. So carrots obviously for the horse, that is, of course. So he had his ways, and as we went into the Middle Ages and as sort of people's beliefs and ideas changed, he relied, instead of ravens, he actually relied on much more of a sort of a generic kind of psychic bubble. But again, he just refuses to share the specifics of these techniques with me. That said, though, I suppose if we all had access to the psychic bubble, it would become quite noisy, wouldn't it? Now, sometimes Santa will write back. And well, he's actually sent over one of his many writing quills. This is actually one of his current quills. This isn't an archaeological artifact, but it's quite an ostentatious feather. I have to say, real sort of like medieval monks would shave off the feathery bits and snip about there, so it's more like a pen. But it seems that Santa likes the feather in the face as he's writing, and occasionally, if you're very, very lucky, you will receive a handwritten response from the man himself. I believe, for example, the Tolkien children were fortunate enough to benefit from that. But ultimately, whether through his ravens, whether just through sort of knowing, or whether actually through receiving letters, Santa has always, it seems, enjoyed hearing from the girls and boys of the world. And in particular, one thing he has actually mentioned is that he loves letters because of the way in which they encourage children to, well, develop their writing skills. The fact that they take the time to write so neatly and carefully in letters to Santa surely must be a good thing. So in so many ways, actually, as much as, yes, now he no longer needs to reconstitute the letters from ash using a machine, one thing which Marion has asked me to pass on from him is that he does very much enjoy receiving letters and does believe in the power of the written word, which I have to say also goes all the way back to his origins. The power of words have always been important from the Vikings through to now. After all, a harsh word can sting you more keenly than any arrow. So the landing area has now been resurfaced, and deliveries will be going ahead as ever on time and without any hiccups. But this really highlights that even though obviously we had Santa, for example, to tell Marion in particular what she had found, it really highlights actually the power of archaeology to find the physical evidence of the past. And in this instance, the letters which hadn't quite gone through the machine, unfortunately, when it was decommissioned, and the evidence of that in the form of ash. This is the power of archaeology, not only finding interesting new ideas from the past, but also physically confirming that the past occurred. What a wonderful, wonderful thing, and what a fantastically exciting sight Santa's Grotto continues to be. Anyway, guys, whatever you want this Christmas, whatever you've written in your letter or email or text, I think you can now text Santa, whatever you sent his way, here's hoping you get everything you want on Christmas morning. And if you don't celebrate Christmas, well, here's hoping you have a lovely, lovely day. From everyone here at Archaeosoup Towers, have a very Merry Christmas. Bye-bye.